This is a video about the discussion post on Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been by Joyce Carol Oates. So at this point, you've read the entire story. Maybe you've even been disturbed by the ending of the story, although the ending does have a couple of different interpretations, some less sinister than others. Now that you've had a chance to read the story, we're going to take a look at what some critics have to say about the story. I always think it's helpful when after you read a story, to look at what other scholars have had to say, and that can be a really good place to start your own essay. You can read what other people have said and then find parts that you agree with, and then find areas where you want to challenge or maybe question some of what the scholars have to say. So here's the assignment. You're going to read two excerpts from two different articles. If you want to read the entire article, that's great. I will link them, but I'm just giving you excerpts of the articles from the professional critics. So the first article is by Gretchen Schultz and R.J.R. Rockwood, and the name of the essay is In Fairyland Without a Map, Connie's Exploration Inward in Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? And the second essay is from Mike Tierce and John Michael Crafton. It's called Connie's Tambourine Man, a New Reading of Arnold Friend. So you have two options, although I would like for you to read both of the excerpts first, then you can decide which option you want to help support, or which professor you want to be the TA for in this discussion board post. So these are professional writers, they're professors who are writing about the story. So if you find their arguments a little bit complicated or a little bit dense, that's okay. They're supposed to be challenging. Let's start with the first one, In Fairyland Without a Map. I'm just going to read some kind of key points from this excerpt. You want to read the whole excerpt on your own. And again, if you want to read the whole article, that will be linked for you. This journey is an essential part of the adolescent's search for personal identity, and though it is a quest that he or she must undertake alone, traditionally it has been the responsibility of culture to help by providing symbolic maps of the territory through which the teenager will travel, territory that lies on the other side of consciousness. Had she, and she is referencing Connie, been nurtured on fairy tales instead of popular songs and movies, she would not feel it such a loss. She would have been to this world before through the vicarious experience offered by fairy tales, and she would have some sense of how to survive there. So the crux of the argument is this. Connie is not given fairy tales. We know that her father is basically negligent. He just sits there reading the newspaper while they're eating. He barely offers grunts. He's not really in the picture, even though he's physically present. He's not really a part of her life. Connie's mother, on the other hand, is much more involved in her life, but she's constantly picking at Connie. So much so that Connie wishes that she were dead and her mother was dead and that everyone were dead at the beginning of the story. Now, obviously, this is just an internal thought that she has, right? She's a teenager who's frustrated with her mother, but it could be a foreshadowing of what happens at the end of the story. So they certainly have not raised Connie on these fairy tales. And where is Connie going with her friends? She's going out driving, she's hanging out with boys, and she's listening to the radio. Keep in mind the setting, the 1960s. Also keep in mind the dedication. Joyce Carol Oates dedicates this story to Bob Dylan. She makes a point to dedicate it to Bob Dylan, so that's the first thing we see when we read this story. In the 1960s, to a lot of teenagers, Bob Dylan was kind of like a messiah figure, a musical messiah figure. People believed that he understood them and could help them transcend their sort of boring, mundane, suburban lives. Also think about the big cultural clashes in the 1960s and how those might be represented in Connie's relationship with her parents. So the idea is, if Connie had been nurtured on these fairy tales as opposed to these trashy songs, and I'm not calling the Bob Dylan songs trashy, but the songs that Connie listens to on the radio are really provocative. They have lyrics that aren't incredibly thought-provoking. Again, not Bob Dylan, but the songs that Connie is listening to on the radio. If she had been nurtured on these fairy tales and really parented, she would have been to this world before. In other words, fairy tales serve a purpose. That's why so many different cultures have fairy tales with these archetypal characters. Somebody who is demonic or who has terrible intentions, but who disguises himself or herself. Think about Little Red Riding Hood. Somebody who tries to get into your house through some sort of manipulation. Think about the Three Little Pigs. Somebody who wants to take you somewhere else or transform. So there are all of these references to fairy tales kind of sprinkled throughout the text, but Connie misses them because she has not been raised on fairy tales. Fairy tales teach children how to avoid danger. Some fairy tales, even though we think of the Disney versions of having happy endings, some fairy tales are quite dark, especially Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales or the Grimm's Brother fairy tales. They can be quite dark, but they teach children how to learn about strangers or things like listening to your parents without them actually having to experience the danger, right? They live vicariously through these fairy tales so that in real life, when they are confronted with a stranger who's in disguise, who's trying to do something sinister, they will recognize what that person is. So had she been nurtured on these fairy tales, she would have lived vicariously through them, and she would have sensed Arnold Friend for who he was before it's too late. And by the way, when I say before it's too late, even though most people read the ending as being really depressing because Connie goes off with him and presumably never comes back again, that is not certain, right? The ending, as we'll see in the next article, is very ambiguous. So as you're reading through, look for fairy tale references. And you might even use your knowledge of Disney movies. Do you see any references to pumpkins? Do you see any references to vehicles like his golden jalopy with all the secret codes on it that are going to take her somewhere else? Also think about the weird codes that Arnold Friend speaks in. Not only does he speak in a sing-songy voice, not only does he have this big hawk-like nose, it's kind of terrifying in terms of its description, but he drives this golden car that has all these codes on it. The numbers 33, 17, 19 are really important. I'll give you a little clue here. There's a biblical reference that connects to the title in a pretty obvious way. You might also think about what the numbers add up to. He also uses an expression that is dated to make himself sound younger, man the flying saucers. Think about what a flying saucer represents in this idea of abduction. Also remember the Bob Dylan song that Joyce Carol Oates says she was listening to at the time of writing this, Mr. Tambourine Man, take me on a ship upon your magic swirling ship. I've linked that in the previous page. And also It's All Over Baby Blue. All of those references to Bob Dylan, but we'll talk about those in the second passage. So what does Connie miss before it's too late? If she knew about fairy tales, if she had learned those lessons, would she have been able to save herself? Let's skip down and look at the instructions. So if you choose this theory to support, if you are pretending that you are the teacher's assistant for Schultz and Rockwood, you are helping them to find evidence from the text that would prove their point about fairy tales. What evidence would you provide? So if you read their entire essay, you can see the evidence that they provide. But I'm leaving that out because I want you to comb through the text looking for evidence that if Connie was raised on fairy tales or were raised on fairy tales, things would be much different for her. So your job is to find one quotation from the story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, that supports their claim. Their claim, not necessarily your claim. Here you're pretending that you are just their assistant looking for evidence from the text to support their assertion, to support their thesis. Please do not repeat the same quote as another student. If you use the same quote as another student, you will not get all 5 points, so make sure you're picking a different quote. And trust me, there are plenty of quotes, especially if you know a little bit about fairy tales. Include the quote in quotation marks and include at least 3 sentences in which you explain how the quotation helps support Schultz and Rockwood's assertion. Okay, let's move on to the second option. This is called Connie's Tambourine Man, or that's a reference to the Bob Dylan song, Mr. Tambourine Man, a new reading of Arnold Friend. This one I think is a little bit trickier, so I'm going to read most of it with you now, and then I'll stop to explain the passages, because when students pick this one, I think it's a fascinating argument. They tend to get a little confused in the second paragraph. Even though Gretchen Schultz and R.J. Rockwood correctly claim that the portrait of Arnold is created in the mind of Connie and that it exists there only, they still persist in having Arnold as demon and Connie as doomed. Quote, "But we know that he is still the wolf and that he still intends to gobble up this little girl as soon as he gets the chance. Connie is not going to live happily ever after. Indeed, it would seem that she is not going to live at all. So you'll see that these critics are in conversation with the previous critics, right? That's what good writers do. They build upon and challenge what other writers have said, and you can do this too in your own essays. While these critics insist on seeing satanic traces in Arnold, and it's true, Arnold has a lot of satanic traces. In fact, take the phrase "man the flying saucers," turn the words around and you'll see that it's an anagram for something else. These critics refuse, on the other hand, to see that these traces are only part of a much more complex, more dynamic symbol. They're indeed diabolic shades to Arnold, but just as Blake and Shelley, these are writers of the Romantic period that we'll be studying in our poetry unit, by the way, just as they could see in Milton's Satan from Paradise Lost a positive, attractive symbol of the poet, the rebellious embodiment of creative energy, so we should also be sensitive to Arnold's multifaceted and creative nature. Within the frame of the story, the fiction of Arnold burns in the day as the embodiment of poetic energy. The story is dedicated to Bob Dylan, the troubadour. That means a lyric poet, also the name of a club in West Hollywood, the artist. Friend is the artist, the actor, the rhetorician, the teacher, all symbolized by Connie's overheated imagination. We should not assume that Arnold is completely evil because she is afraid of him. Her limited perceptions remind us of Blake's questioner in The Tiger, which we'll also read later this semester, who begins to perceive the frightening element of the experiential world, but also is rather duped into his fear by his own limitations. Like the figure in Blake, Connie is the framer, the story creator, and the diabolic traces in her fiction frighten her not because they are manifestations of an outside evil, but because they are the symbolic extrapolations from her own psyche. Rising out of Connie's radio, Arnold Friend / Bob Dylan is a magical musical messiah. He persuades Connie to abandon her father's house. As a manifestation of her own desires, he frees her from the limitations of a 15-year-old girl, assisting in her maturation by stripping her of her childlike vision. Whoa, there's a lot to unpack there. So first off, you might be shocked that the argument is Arnold Friend is not a killer, and we know that Joyce Carol Oates has said herself that she modeled this off of real-life murders that took place in Tucson, Arizona. The argument here is Arnold Friend is not a killer. He's a savior figure. He's a messiah figure, a musical messiah who takes her away from her father's house, a negligent father, a boring, humdrum suburban life, a mother who doesn't understand her, into this new plane of existence, into this new way of seeing the world. And the writers use Arnold Friend / Bob Dylan because they're suggesting that these two characters are one and the same. Just as Bob Dylan was this he's still alive, and won the Nobel Prize for Literature, by the way. It was a transformational figure to so many young people during that time. It makes sense that they're conflating the two. Also, and students always get offended by this, but the description of Arnold Friend does match how Bob Dylan looked in this time period. The description of the hair, the nose, the stature, all match how Bob Dylan looked. I will post a picture of Bob Dylan on this page so you can get a sense of the connection there. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what they were saying about Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost. So to the Romantic poets, to Blake, to Shelley, a creative person or a creative entity like the tiger or Satan isn't necessarily evil or demonic. In fact, in Paradise Lost, Satan is a really likable, engaging, dynamic character. So while Tierce and Crafton aren't saying that the previous critics are 100% wrong, they agree with them to a certain extent. These writers say, yeah, there are some kind of sinister and satanic traces to Arnold Friend. Ultimately, he is this musical messiah. And ultimately, Connie's fear of him is not so much about Arnold Friend himself, but it's about what's going on with her internally. Just like the speaker in The Tiger is questioning the tiger and is learning to come to terms with what the terrifying world of experience might mean. Don't worry too much about that because we're going to read The Tiger later in the semester. So if you find this argument compelling and you want to pretend that you're the teacher's assistant for Tiersten Crafton, here's what you have to do. You have to comb through the text of where are you going, where have you been, to find a quotation that would support their point of view. And there are several different quotes that you could use. And since their argument is pretty complex, there's the Bob Dylan angle, there's the musical Messiah angle, there is the romantic poet angle, there's the Connie Psyche angle. So there's all these kind of ways into this argument. It should be very easy for you to find a quotation that is original. So in other words, please do not pick a quote that another classmate has already used. We want to build off of each other's ideas, just like these critics are in conversation with each other. And I've included a picture just of that I found online of Cinderella's carriage. I think what people find so interesting about the story, the reason that it's been anthologized over and over again, is that you can read it so many different times and find different things. There are codes everywhere. Think about when Arnold Friend makes a big X symbol in the air. Think about how when he pulls into her driveway, Connie says, Christ, Christ. How should we interpret that? Is she afraid? At the same time that she says that, she's trying to fix her hair. Think about the bumper sticker on his car that not only says mind the flying saucers, but he has a bumper sticker that says done by a crazy woman driver. Most young women would be aware that that's a man who is, at the very least, kind of a jerk or just kind of a tool, or he is a misogynist, and she should be aware that that's a sign that he is something different than he appears to be. The fact that he's short, but he's pretending to be tall by stuffing his shoes. If Connie had been nurtured on fairy tales, would she realize that somebody pretending to be something they're not might be sinister, or not so much? Would that not have saved her in the end? And again, the second essay kind of rests on the assumption that we don't know for sure what happens to her once she gets into Arnold Friend's car. Okay, I look forward to seeing your quotations, and please feel free to comment on classmates' posts.